Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Diana Vasquez, BERDO Review Board Manager with the Environment Department. The BERDO Review Board does not currently have an acting chair, doesn't have an appointed chair. So I'll lead us in a vote for acting chair. Does anyone of the board members want to make a nomination for acting chair for today's meeting?
I nominate Kai Palmer Dunning as acting chair.
Thank you, Board Member Lattimore. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Board Member O'Malley. I'll now lead us in a vote, roll call style. Board Member Boyd.
Rashida Boyd.
Oh, sorry. How do you vote? In favor, oppose, or abstain from?
Oh, sorry. In favor.
In
I
favor?
apologize.
No, that's
Yes.
okay. Board Member Ellis.
In favor.
Board Member Jacobs.
In favor.
Board Member Lattimore.
In favor.
Board Member Nelson.
In favor.
Board Member O'Malley.
Aye.
And Board Member Palmer Dunning.
In favor.
Great. I'll now hand the meeting over to acting chair, Board Member Palmer Dunning.
Great, thanks, Diana. Thanks, everybody. Welcome. Good afternoon. I'm calling this public hearing to order at 4:36 in accordance with the Building Emissions Reduction and Disclosure Ordinance regulations adopted pursuant to the Building Emissions Reduction and Disclosure Ordinance Boston City Code Ordinance Section 7-2.2. The BERDO Review Board will hold a virtual public hearing at 4:30 on November 20th to review the following topics in regard to the reduction of greenhouse gases from building energy production and consumption so as to promote and the public health and welfare of Boston residents. In accordance with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts executive order suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law, we are conducting this public meeting online to ensure public access to the deliberations of the BERDO Review Board. The public may access this call through phone and video conferencing. Members of the public will have an opportunity to ask questions and provide public comment. To do so, please raise your hand or type in the chat in the application via the Zoom meeting platform. If you are calling in and cannot use the platform, you can raise your hand by pressing *9 and send your questions to staff via email at berdoreviewboard@boston.gov. For the record, my name is Kai Palmer Dunning, the acting chair of the board, and I will now conduct a roll call of board members. Board members, please say your name in order as they appear on the slide. Rashida Boyd.
Stephen Ellis.
Lavette Jacobs.
Gail Lattimore.
Jack Nelson. Matt O'Malley.
And Kai Palmer Dunning. And now we'll have staff introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. Diana Vasquez with the Environment Department.
Hannah Payne with the Environment Department.
Hi everyone, Claudia Diaz Martinez, Environment Department.
And Aladdin Joroff, Environment Department.
Great, thanks everybody for joining us. And here is the agenda for today's meeting. We are going to start with the approval of meeting minutes. Next, the environment staff will present updates following an APCC hearing, which will include comments received from the last comment period and revised draft regulations on hardship compliance plans, the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund, fines and enforcement, and miscellaneous clarifying topics. We will then shift to administrative updates and finally adjourn the meeting. So first on the agenda, we will go to approving the previous meeting minutes on November 6th. Are there any questions or comments regarding the meeting minutes from last meeting? Great. Hearing no questions or comments, is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Can I get a second?
Second.
Great. On that motion to approve the meeting minutes, and the board will all in favor say aye, and show your hands.
Aye.
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 Great. Do we have any abstentions? Great. Next, moving on to the next agenda item, which will be an update and discussion on the latest regarding regulation development, and I'll pass it to staff.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I will kick us off. And just in case there's any members of the public here that were present at the last Air Pollution Control Commission hearing that took place last Wednesday, we will present the same information that we presented there. Yeah, so I'll kick us off with the next slide. This is just a reminder of the regulations topics that we are covering during this third phase. The Air Pollution Control Commission has already voted to approve building portfolios and individual compliance schedules, and we're currently working on hardship compliance plans, the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund, fines and enforcement, as well as other clarifying regulations related to compliance with BERDO. Next slide, please. As a reminder, we have close to public comment periods related to these topics that I just mentioned. First, we had a formal public comment period on draft regulations for both hardship compliance plans and the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund. That comment period ran between September 29th and October 20th. And then we had a different formal public comment period for draft policies for hardship compliance plans, as well as an informal public comment period on preliminary proposals related to fines and enforcement. That comment period ran between October 19th and November 9th. So today we'll present the main comments that we received during these two public comment periods, as well as the revised regulations that we made in response to this feedback. So on the first comment period that I mentioned, we received letters from the following institutions and individuals: A Better City, Alternatives for Community and Environment, and Partners, the Conference of Boston Teaching Hospitals, Eversource, the Green Ribbon Commission's Higher Education Working Group, Longwood Medical Energy Collaborative, Longwood Collective, Mass General Brigham, NAIOP, and three individuals: Nicole Voss from East Kennedy Architects, and Lori Hayes and Tom McDonald from the Boston Climate Action Network. On the second comment period I mentioned, we received letters from A Better City, Alternatives for Community and Environment, the Conference of Boston Teaching Hospitals, Longwood Medical Energy Collaborative, Longwood Collective, and two individuals, Heidi Buckley and Nicole Voss again. Slide, please. And I'll pass it to Hannah to start us off with hardship compliance plans.
Great, thank you. And let me know if you can't hear me. I'm testing out a new sound setup on here. So, so I will go through the proposed revisions on hardship compliance plans. Next slide. So the first thing that we received a number of comments from both of the comment periods on hardship compliance plans. So we had presented draft language on hardship compliance plans, regulations, policies, and a draft application for hardship compliance plans, and received comments on all of those. And this is a very brief summary of the comments we received. We've also published a very detailed summary and response that is response to every comment that we received through both of the comment periods. So for board members who want to take a deeper look at any of these, that material is available online, and Diana may have already shared that with you as well. But the main themes that we heard from the public comments on hardship compliance plans include requests to clarify the distinction between circumstances and characteristics that could create hardship and eligible hardship, so distinguishing between those two things, suggesting additional circumstances and characteristics that could create a hardship, requesting the elimination of application fees for hardship compliance plans, and to define what reasonable fees are to secure outside consultants to evaluate hardship compliance plan applications, suggesting potential conditions of approval for hardship compliance plans, requesting to extend the application deadline for hardship compliance plans, requesting to clarify the process to review long-term hardship every 5 years and to modify building portfolios with an approved HCP, concerns about the length of the application form, as well as on the other side, concerns about not requesting enough information on the application form, particularly related to environmental justice and impacts on tenants, general clarifying questions regarding the meaning of draft language, and then finally requesting more time to provide public feedback. Next slide. So just as a reminder, I believe this was shared previously with the board. This is the general approach that the regulations propose that would constitute the steps that need to be followed for a hardship compliance plan application. The first step would be to demonstrate the existence of a unique circumstance or characteristic. And these are spelled out in the draft regulations. So these can be financial, regulatory, or contractual, technical or operational, or other. However, the existence of one or more of these circumstances and characteristics alone does not constitute an eligible hardship. So once you've identified your unusual circumstances and characteristics, the next step would be to evaluate all of your compliance and flexibility options. So doing an assessment of what are my options available outside of hardship to comply with BERDO. So after an evaluation of that, then you would look at step 1 and step 2 together to determine if they create an eligible hardship. And those eligible hardships that the regulations propose are requiring space, equipment, or electric service that is not available, significantly interfering with or significantly increasing the cost to provide services that are critical to community health and safety, and or creating an undue burden on building owner in terms of cost. The final step of the application for hardship compliance plans would be to request relief and propose an alternative compliance plan. So these have not shifted materially in the update. There are a few tweaks that I'll go through in detail next, but this general approach remains the same in the revision. And we've also added some clarifying explanatory language to the regulations to try to make it a little bit more clear what the expectations are that follow these steps, as they're spelled out already in the regulations, but we heard again and again in the comment letters that it's confusing, and rightfully so. It is a little bit confusing. So we tried to clarify that with some explanatory language. Next slide. So we did make some revisions to the draft language on hardship compliance plans. In the slide deck, in red, those are edits we've made, and then in blue are new sections we've added. So you can see we've done a lot of editing in this section of the regulations. Next slide. So I'm going to go through the revisions that we've made in this round of edits. First, we under types of hardship compliance plans, we clarified that a short-term hardship compliance plan may be extended once due to an extenuating condition for up to 12 months. However, an owner seeking relief for additional time must apply for a long-term hardship compliance plan. So again, short-term is really intended for those unforeseen circumstances that come up where maybe you need a couple more years for planning. You have something falls through that you were planning on. The company you were working with to do your retrofit goes bankrupt, something like that, where it's kind of unforeseen, out of your hands. And this would just allow for, if you already have that short-term hardship and something further delays it unexpectedly, that you could extend that for up to 12 months. But beyond that, then you would have to come back to the board to seek long-term hardship. Under circumstances and characteristics, we clarified that the regulatory or contractual category which includes long-term energy contracts and long-term leases without reopeners. And we changed the language to be signed prior to October 2021 to align with the signing of the BERDO of the ordinance. We added added low-income owners of buildings that provide affordable housing to low-income tenants as an example of the circumstance in the other category. We clarified that the other category includes other circumstances and characteristics that are financial, regulatory, contractual, technical, or operational. And then we made some minor revisions to improve syntax and clarity. Next slide. We updated under eligibility for hardship compliance plan. We clarified that if a hardship compliance plan is for a building portfolio, an eligible hardship must be shown to exist at the building portfolio level. So this means that while even if just one single building can demonstrate that hardship, that's part of a portfolio, it doesn't necessarily mean that the entire portfolio is eligible for a hardship. So you would have to demonstrate that if you're going for the whole portfolio to get a hardship compliance plan, you need to demonstrate that as a portfolio, you have an eligible hardship. Similarly, we clarified that for a building portfolio, the requested hardship compliance plan would apply to all buildings in the building portfolio. So again, if an owner has a building portfolio already approved, if they're coming to request a hardship compliance plan for that portfolio, it would need to cover the entire portfolio. It again could not be for individual buildings within that portfolio. We clarified that if an owner requests a waiver or reduction of fines as part of the hardship compliance plan application process, the review board may consider factors described in the enforcement regulations. We added that to be eligible to apply for a hardship compliance plan, the owner must not have previously been denied a hardship compliance plan for the same application. However, an owner may submit a new application if there are material changes to the unusual circumstances or characteristics of an owner, building portfolio, or hardship they create. So this just means that an owner can't come back to the board time and time again with the same application with no changes of their circumstances. However, if things do change, they could come back and apply for the same building that they may have been denied for previously if there is something that is different about their application. And then again, minor revisions to that section as well as the section on applications for hardship compliance plans. Next slide. We added a new section called consultant review. So this is replacing what had previously been application fees. We've now, based on comments we received, eliminated the application fees for hardship compliance plans. However, we have maintained that the review board may request reasonable payments from applicants to secure outside consultants to advise in the review of applications for hardship compliance plans. We also clarified that the factors that the review board could use to determine the reasonable payment. We think that some of the applications for hardship, will be fairly straightforward and likely will not need to have additional support for the review board to review them and make a decision on. Others will be quite technically complicated and also could be requesting a significant amount of relief. And for those, there would likely be a need to have some outside consultant support to be able to adequately review those very technical requests. So there is, I think we're thinking there will be a scale in terms of what might be needed in this section, but that it will likely scale with the amount of relief that is being requested through the plan. Under conditions for approval, just some minor edits. Under process for hardship compliance plan applications, we revised language to allow applications for short-term hardship compliance plans to be submitted at least 3 months before the first year in which the hardship compliance plan would be effective. And then similarly, or in addition, we added that owners who experience unexpected or unforeseeable events or conditions outside of their control after that deadline for a short-term plan, so after 3 months before the first year, so let's say in December or even in February of a compliance year, that they could apply for short-term hardship compliance during that compliance year. So again, your building floods and you weren't planning on it, and what you were going to spend on alternative compliance payments, you have to pay for an emergency. That type of example is kind of what we're thinking for those unforeseeable events that may happen during a compliance year. However, An owner's failure to plan for compliance shall not constitute a cause to submit an application during a compliance year. So an owner can't come to the review board and just say, I didn't plan for this, you know, can I get some relief this year? That won't be acceptable, but it's for that unforeseen example. Next slide, thank you. Under process for hardship compliance plan applications, we revised language to allow applications for long-term hardship compliance plans to be submitted at least 9 months before the first year in which the hardship compliance plan would be effective. So again, this is shortening the timeline up in response to comments. We clarified that the review board shall hold a public hearing within 45 days of the Environment Department finding of completeness for applications seeking relief. That would begin in the next 2 years. So again, prioritizing those that are seeking relief sooner than others. We added that prior to the hearing, owners must provide proof that the owner notified tenants in writing about the hearing. So this is for buildings that have tenants. They need to notify their tenants that they are applying for a hardship compliance plan when they have a hearing scheduled, so that tenants may attend the review board hearing and provide public comment on that application. We've stated that the Environment Department will provide a template for owners to use for that outreach with building owners, and will provide translated versions of that template that an owner could fill in with the address, time, link to the hearing, and application materials. We clarified that owners only need to record decisions that approve a hardship compliance plan, and added that pending an application for a hardship compliance plan or an appeal of a review board decision regarding a hardship compliance plan shall not stay a building owner's compliance obligations. So if they're waiting on an application to be approved, or they've appealed the decision of the review board regarding a hardship compliance plan, those owners will still have to meet their typical BERDO compliance until there's resolution on that plan application. And I'm seeing a few questions in the chat. Chair Palmer, do you want me to answer those now?
No, I was just flagging it for later, so I wouldn't forget to ask it. Feel free to come back.
Okay. Okay, so that was this section. So next slide. I'm almost done with hardship compliance plans, I think. Only a couple more slides. Under modifications to modifications of approved hardship compliance plans, we've clarified the language regarding modifications to building portfolios with an approved hardship compliance plan and how that will interact. Clarify that owners must record any modification to a hardship compliance plan. Clarified that owners seeking to modify both a building portfolio that already has a hardship compliance plan and the hardship compliance plan, they may submit a combined modification application. So if a portfolio has a hardship plan and they're already approved and they want to modify both their portfolio and hardship compliance plan, they could come to the board with the combined application and do it with one hearing. We added in a section around periodic review of the long-term hardship compliance plan. There were several comments that were raised confusion around the review process for those long-term plans. So we're clarifying that here in its own standalone section. So again, hardship compliance plan, long-term plans will need to be reviewed every 5 years by the board. So we added language about the information owners will need to present as part of the periodic review. We clarified that if the review board determines that there has been a material change in the circumstances, characteristics, or hardship that were the basis for the hardship compliance plan, if there's changes in relevant technology, applicable regulatory requirements, or other relevant factors, that the review board may amend the relief and conditions of a plan. And then finally, doing some just renumbering to different references. Next slide. And then in policy language, on this topic, we added language specifying the information owners will need to provide when proposing special conditions for the approval. We deleted language regarding reasonable fees for outside consultants because we moved that into regulations. We deleted language regarding periodic review of long-term hardship compliance plans because, again, we moved that into its new section regulations, and then some minor edits. So I believe that was all on hardship. So I think it might be, I can take the questions now before we get into the next topic so that your thoughts are still fresh on hardship, if that is a good proposal for you, Chair.
Yeah, I think that would be good. I just I said we were talking about two topics. I just want to make sure I didn't forget my question for later. I'm also happy to wait till later as well. Board Member Lattimore, is that okay to wait till the end?
I would actually prefer to get the answers now because there's a lot of information and then I'm trying to make sure that I understand all of it. And I don't know how others feel, but I would like to get the information just for this section before we move on to others. That's my preference.
Okay, yeah, let's do the hardship compliance plan questions first then.
Great. So I can, do you want me to start by answering the questions in the chat?
Sure, I can just say them out loud. So my question was, can a building owner that has a portfolio apply for a hardship compliance plan for a single building in their portfolio?
So the proposal is that you can apply for a hardship compliance plan for your entire portfolio, or if you have an approved portfolio for the entire portfolio, but not just for an individual building in that portfolio. So if you are, let's say you own a lot of buildings in Boston, you could choose to put, choose to apply to put them all into a portfolio, and then either just comply with the portfolio flexibility, or if you have that portfolio, apply for all of those buildings to get hardship, or you could choose to do, you know, a variety of different other means of complying building by building, having a hardship compliance plan for a building, but not all of your buildings. But you can't have a hardship compliance plan for one building in a portfolio. And that's because the portfolio is already going to change the emission standard across all the buildings. And so then to have one that kind of stands alone in their hardship plan doesn't make sense in terms of how we would do those emissions accounting.
Great, thank you. Board Member Lattimore, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, so I was somewhat similar. If you could go back to, I think it's the slide that has G, I think, in it, either G or H. Yeah, and my question was somewhat similar when you were talking about let's see, okay, yeah, there, thank you. H on this page, where someone had an unforeseen or unexpected event or condition. You use the example of, I don't know, like a flood or something like that. I think I was wondering the same thing. It's like, for example, I you know, as an affordable housing developer, we own, you know, 1,000+ units of affordable housing. And so we very likely, I have to double check with our team, but we very likely will apply for a building portfolio at the portfolio level, I would imagine.
Yeah.
But if one of the buildings in my portfolio experience a flood, unexpected event like a flood, that still doesn't qualify the entire portfolio for hardship compliance plan, correct? But if it were but I could apply for individual building compliance. I think I got the terminology right. Individual compliance plan for each of my properties, in which case that particular property, if it had that same flood or unexpected event, could qualify. Do you follow? Did I make sense with that?
Yes, I think you mean hardship compliance plan, not individual, but otherwise, yes, totally understand the question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because you could apply for your whole portfolio, or you could have each of your buildings, which is called individual compliance plan. No, did I get that terminology right? No,
hardship compliance plan. An individual compliance schedule, I know there's a lot of terms, is a separate compliance flexibility compliance pathway. So you're asking about hardship, I believe.
Yes, I am. I'm trying to make sure I understand the distinction between hardship on an individual versus building portfolio level.
Yep.
Okay. Mhm.
So that is a good question, and I think one that we might need to think on and clarify a little bit more, because I think there's some that it's a little bit different when you're applying for long-term hardship versus short-term, and I think we could probably clarify that section based on the example you provided, Board Member Lattimore, because I think we were kind of thinking about that example for an individual building, but I think that's a really good question of what would happen with a portfolio if, for example, the building that you were planning to decarbonize in your portfolio next has an unforeseen event. So I think we can take a closer look at that, but that's a good thing to flag. Thank you.
Thank you. And then just the prior slide, I think there was something about affordable, if you go to the prior slide, it was something about affordable housing owners and maybe it was the
Claudia,
prior, yeah.
I think we maybe actually changed the proposed language. I think this might actually be an older version. So I was just, while I was reading that, I was like, I want to pull up what we actually included in our final. I
Let's see,
believe
there it is, circumstances. So you added that low-income owners of buildings that provide affordable housing as an example of a circumstance in the other. Okay, that's just, all right. I think I follow.
Yes. And Claudia,
That's the language that we used.
That is the language that we used. Okay. I know we made a last minute change there, and then I was making sure. Okay, yes. So we updated this to low-income owners of buildings that provide affordable housing to low-income tenants.
Okay. And that means that's another category that could automatically be eligible for hardship compliance plans, or just another category, other category, period.
This is another circumstance or characteristic. And so this is, again, trying to address concerns that we heard about, have encountered through BERDO too, of just low income owners who are providing affordable housing in some capacity to, this might be like a smaller building or landlord that has like maintained reasonable rents and has naturally occurring affordable housing, could come and claim this type of circumstance, and then provide the other evidence that is necessary to then demonstrate the full hardship.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you,
Thank you, Aladian, for jumping in.
And thank you, Acting Chair, for allowing the conversation and questions.
Yeah, of course. Just to flag, I know that Board Member O'Malley has to leave at 5:30. So I just want to see if the rest of the board was okay to wait till the end of the next section of this agenda item before we have any more questions.
I can jump in. There is a board Q&A after the fund, so
yeah,
I think we can as a breakup.
Great, awesome. I'm sorry to take things out of order, but appreciate it. Flexibility.
Okay, and I will pass this over to Claudia for the next section. And I know hardship was long. The other ones are shorter.
Yes, thank you for your patience going through all this content. I'll basically do the same for the fund, provide a summary of the comments that we've received in the public comment periods, and then the revisions that were made to the language. So in the public feedback related to the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund, we had letters requesting to create a sort of project evaluation form for the review board to use to make funding decisions. There were suggestions that emissions reduction should be prioritized in funding decisions, requests to clarify language for certain project evaluation criteria. There was also a suggestion of adding an additional project evaluation criteria related to energy justice, suggestions of potential conditions that the reviewer could set for funded projects, requests for transparent tracking, monitoring, and evaluation of the fund, and general clarifying questions that we had about the draft language. So before we go into more specific language revisions, we wanted to present the overall process to make funding decisions in the fund. And a reminder that per the ordinance requirements, the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund will only fund projects that produce direct emissions reductions in buildings located in Boston. So the process for funding decisions would start by the City of Boston receiving all applications and screening them for completeness and eligibility. This means making sure that the project request provided all the information that was required and that they're actually eligible for the fund, meaning that they produce those direct emissions reductions in local buildings. Once the City of Boston screen those applications, then the reviewer would receive all the complete and eligible applications. Then, according to the ordinance requirements, the reviewer would prioritize projects with direct benefits to environmental justice populations and populations affected by air pollution. The review board would also evaluate all projects according to the evaluation criteria that are in the proposed regulations. And one of the evaluation criteria there is also the scale and timeline of emissions reduction. And based on this whole process, the review board would then identify projects for funding. Next slide, please. So similarly, here you can see the sections that are in the regulations language for the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund. And here we make revisions related to the application process, funding decisions, and conditions for expenditure. Next slide. In the section for the application process, we added that the application must include, if applicable, a description of any previous funding received by the applicant from the fund and or past applications to the fund, so that the reviewer can easily identify any projects that were, or any building owners that have already received funding through the fund. Then on the section regarding funding decisions, we clarified the description of benefits to affordable housing and tenant protections. This was directly in response to comments requesting to clarify this description. We also clarified the name and description of the benefits to indoor air quality and healthy environments for building occupants. This was also in direct response to comments seeking to clarify these benefits. We also added a new project evaluation criteria related to energy justice benefits. This would be related to the expected timeline and scale of benefits related to reducing energy bills for building occupants and or contributing to community ownership or control over energy infrastructure. We also added in this section that the reviewers shall develop and may periodically update a project review form, and that the reviewer will present said project review form for comment at a public hearing and shall use that form to inform funding decisions. Next slide, please. And still in the funding decisions section, we also clarified that if there are insufficient eligible proposals for 3 or more consecutive application cycles or for 3 years, then the Environment Department shall conduct community outreach and education about the fund. Finally, in the conditions for expenditure section, we added 3 standard conditions that were suggested in public comments. First, that for long-term projects or projects that include distinct phases or deliverables, there will be a schedule for allocating awarded funds. For example, if a project would take place over several years or it has different phases like a feasibility study and then the implementation of a building retrofit, then the funds could be awarded by year, for example, or by deliverable. We also added a standard condition related to reporting related to special conditions, and also that if the funding recipient fails to spend the funding and or fails to comply with the terms and conditions of expenditure, then the reviewer may consider limiting their access to new funding applications in the future. And we also made other minor revisions to improve clarity of the language. And yes, that's it for the fund. So happy to take questions on both hardship and the fund item.
Great, thank you both Hannah and Claudia for going through those those pieces of the agenda. So now we will be ask each board member if they have any questions or comments, and thank you for everybody's patience and getting through all of that. So starting with board member Boyd. She might not be available at the moment. Board Member Ward, if you do have any questions, feel free to raise your hand, and we will come back to you. Board Member Ellis.
I apologize. No, I don't have any questions at the moment. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. First off, I appreciate all of the additional work that went into updating the draft. I'm starting with the hardship compliance payments, and especially the section on the addition related to the low income and housing for, addition for affordable housing. So one question that I have about reasonable payment, Hannah, I think you may have started to get into an example about what the scale that the board could request in terms of relief, and I'm having a little bit of a hard time of trying to imagine what that looks like. So is it possible, like, do you have a concrete example of what that may look like if it happened in real time?
Thanks for the question. Are you looking for a concrete example of like the cost itself? Or
yeah. Well, not the exact cost, but like more so when we would actually enact it, because I think it's a little bit of a different circumstance now that we would come to them for a financial cost after the application was submitted.
Sure. So I can try to provide an example or two, but welcome other team members to share if they have any better examples. So for example, let's say there's a manufacturer that's subject to BERDO. They have a technical process that they've been doing and say, I can't decarbonize this, whether that is machine or lab equipment or something like that, where it's and they're saying, I can't, this doesn't exist to decarbonize, or there isn't a feasible pathway for this, and here's all this information I've provided. The expectation in that case might be that, maybe there's that expertise on the review board for that very specific technical process, but likely, we might not have that expertise in the, environment department or in the review board, and would need some outside assistance to be able to fully review that application and understand those details. So that is one example. There are also, I just want to share with the board that there are precedents for this type of thing. The Conservation Commission makes requests for fees for outside consultants that are hired by, the commission to provide technical review of things, so that there is some precedent there. And again, it would really scale. So if like if it's someone who says, I have a building subject to BERDO and I am, affordable housing provider, or I have, one of the other things that can like constitute a hardship where there is a real financial constraint, a space constraint, they cannot fit within their footprint, what they need to do to decarbonize their building. And it's fairly straightforward in most of those cases where it's a small building, a small request for relief, or if it's something shorter term hardship of, hey, I need 6 years to get my financing in place and do these plans, those kinds of things. I don't foresee the need to request for that consultant fee, but this creates the opportunity for the review board to have that flexibility to request that outside help.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, was someone about to jump in?
I was just going to add that I think Hannah's examples are illustrated by the factors in the proposed regulations that we suggested the review board could consider when deciding whether to request a fee for a consultant. And that does, as Hannah was saying, look at the number and size and uses of buildings that a hardship compliance plan would apply to, the number and types of circumstances and characteristics that are creating a hardship, the type and amount of relief requested, and the extent to which application material was provided by a third party not related to the applicant. So those are just examples of factors that the review board could consider, but to get to Hannah's point that it's not envisioned for every scenario.
Got it. And so the scale, I think, is still very much what we discussed last time. Like, I don't know if we ever settled on a final scale. Was it based on square footage? Was it based on and that's why I think the scale for me is still a bit confusing because we haven't decided that yet.
I think what we heard when Hannah, please feel free to correct me, was that putting a scale just on square footage or number of buildings might not be nuanced enough to capture where there's actually complexity. So we're trying to put factors that could actually be tuned into complexity rather than a one size, so to speak, fits all scenario.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll make sure to review that section again. Sorry, Hannah. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. What I think the scale that we've been thinking about is scaling to the amount of admissions that you're requesting relief from. So, I think one way to think about it is like the scale of if you were just to make alternative compliance payments to come into compliance with BERDO, how much financial relief are you asking for? And if it's a significant amount of money, then asking for some payment to be able to do due diligence to review that is, I think, another way to think about this scale in terms of relief.
Thank you. Moving on from that question, I just wanted to make sure I understand. So an owner that we say go back to later on and we're requesting, in this case, reasonable payment, could essentially appeal this position because before it would have been a part of the application to pay with the application. So now they have an opportunity to appeal that if we requested reasonable payment. Is that something that we're prepared for?
Yes, so it is changed from a requirement to a request. And then it will be up to the review board to consider whether it has sufficient information to make the determination. Yep, so it'd be part of the discussion with the applicant at that point.
Okay. All right, not a problem. Moving on, the earlier in the slide, you mentioned that the public comments expressed some concerns about the length of the application, particularly related to environmental justice impacts to the tenant. I'm not sure, maybe I missed it, but I didn't really see where that was being addressed in some of the edits of the existing document. So if you can just clarify to me what changes were made to address that concern.
Sure. So one of the kind of key thing that we've added is, and it's not in the application form itself, but that there's now a requirement that for buildings with tenants that they have to notice their tenants that they're applying for a hardship compliance plan and that they're having a hearing with the review board. And the intention behind that is to make sure that tenants are aware of this. And then also if the owner is either claiming a circumstance or characteristic that pertains to the tenant, that they can either attest to that or provide input on that. And similarly, if the owner is then proposing conditions of their relief, that and those, if they relate to tenants, that tenants can again be part of that process. So that is the primary place where we have added in a new requirement there. Some of the, that I would say that's the main thing, and we are trying to strike that balance between getting a lot of information so the board can make a decision that is reasonable, but also making sure that we're not making it overly burdensome and asking questions that will be very challenging for owners to answer as well.
Thank you. Those are all my questions at this time.
Great, thank you, Board Member Ellis. To go a bit out of order, I want to see if Board Member O'Malley had any questions before he has to log off.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No questions at this time. Brief comment. Thank you again to the environment team for this great work. I know it is thankless and it's juggling a million balls at once, but really appreciate it. The work product only gets better and better with every week. So thank you, Mr. Chair, for taking me out of order. And apologies that I have to log off a little bit early, but I will review the rest of this meeting tomorrow. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you, Board Member O'Malley. Next, Board Member Jacobs, do you have any questions?
No questions from me at the moment.
Okay, Board Member Lattimore.
Yeah, I wanted to go back one slide I wanted to understand, not to be too punitive, but the there was something in there about the use of funds, and the fail-safe, that last one, if the funding recipient, or the next to the last bullet, if the funding recipient fails to spend the funding or fails to comply with the terms of the expenditure, the board can consider limiting their access to new funding applications. Is that the extent? I mean, of course, we want to try to be helpful with the Equitable Emissions Fund, but if someone is failing to comply with the terms and conditions of the expenditure, is the only kind of consequence that they're limited in access to future funding? I mean, I think about it as, I wonder if that's, if someone is not using the funds as intended, what, if any, other consequences there might be?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I think one important thing to note is that the first bullet point under there around for longer term projects that include different phases and deliverables, that there will be a schedule for allocating the awarded funds. So the expectation there is that, maybe you'll have a design phase. If you fail to meet the expectations of the fund in that first phase, you won't get the remainder of the funding. And with that, like reporting and phasing, we hope that people will be using their funding adequately. So that is like the main thing. We're not expecting that for very large projects that we would just grant everything out at the beginning and hope that it goes well, but that we'd space it out and have to get deliverables back to make sure that things are progressing as planned. Aladdin, I don't know if you would want to add anything else to that.
I think you covered it.
Okay, thank you. I mean, that again, not to try to be punitive, but just that piece that talks about fails to spend or fails to comply with the terms and conditions of expenditure is what triggered that for me. I mean, I think about as an affordable housing developer, if I'm out of compliance with paying my real estate taxes on one of my developments, I have a problem with the city getting additional funding. So it's just made me feel like, okay, that's interesting. You don't get another opportunity to get more money if you fail to comply with the terms, as opposed to something that's a little more stringent. That's my only comment there, but.
Great. Thank you, Board Member Lattimore. Board Member Nelson.
Thank you. Will the city be requiring bidding if they're applying for investment funds to put towards a project to reduce their emissions?
So your question is about the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund, correct?
Yes, yeah. So if the owner is applying for funds to apply towards a project, does the owner have to bid the project per the city's bidding requirements?
Great. Thank you. I understand the question now. So there would be an application process that would happen outside of the city bidding process. It would be an application process that is defined in the regulations and would be governed by the review board. So it would be a little bit separate from that typical city procurement process. But Aladdin, do you want to jump in?
I think, I'm not sure if you're asking about that phase or the second phase. Once an owner is awarded funds, whether they would have to go through certain procurement and bidding processes.
Yes.
And that would be something that the review board could consider in special conditions on an award of funding, but it would not be an automatic condition the way the regulations are written. So that'd be at the discretion of the review board to consider, the size of the funding, the work, that type of thing.
But I imagine the funding could be hundreds of thousands of dollars, correct?
Right. If we're looking at an implementation rather than a study phase, it could be. And so, that's definitely we've reserved with the discretion of the review board to think about what special conditions would make sense on that award of funding.
Okay. And distribution of the funds. So as that project were to progress and they are paying the contractor, will the city distribute those funds as the project proceeds? And will the city inspect the progress to make sure that the dollars are spent appropriately?
So I think that's another place where there is room for the review board to have discretion in terms of when they want to add a schedule for disbursement for funds. And again, to your point, it's probably going to depend on the size of the project. Again, smaller ones are different than these very large, multi-year phased projects. The review board, working with the department, obviously does have the discretion to inspect projects that receive funding from the fund. So there would be an opportunity to check either, paper records or the work itself to check for compliance.
Okay. So these requirements will be captured through the review process by the board, and then the board will make that one of the stipulations or requirements of the funding.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. That's all I have for questions.
Thank you, Board Member Nelson. And then I have two questions, one about the hardship compliance plan. So the building owners are required to let their tenants know of an upcoming hearing. Are there also any requirements or requirements around sharing their hardship compliance plan submission with the tenants as well, or just letting them know of the hearing?
Yeah, so we were trying to make this as straightforward as possible because we know that some owners will have hundreds or maybe thousands of tenants in BL's case, that trying to strike the right balance here. So what we've currently proposed is that the Environment Department would make a template that would be translated, so the owner could just make those photocopies with the information of their address and a link, and then that link would go to a website that would have information on the hearing and how to request translated materials and or interpretation at that hearing. So it wouldn't necessarily be like provided the whole application to folks, but there would be a way to go find that online and also request those translation and interpretation services that the city would then provide. I think that was there another part to your question? Sorry.
Nope, that was it. That answered it. Thank you. And then my second question is on the Equitable Missions Investment Fund. Can you explain a little more the thought process behind the community outreach after 3 years if the plan doesn't receive, if the fund doesn't receive proposals? Why not sooner than that?
Thanks for the question. I mean, I think that was kind of a reasonable, we were thinking was a reasonable time frame. If we're not getting any applications or are not able to spend the funding, we want to get this funding out the door. We don't expect there will be a lack of applications or interest in this funding. We've heard time and time again, there is probably way more interest than funding we will have available. So we don't expect that, but we had language in there previously that was, people rightfully commented on around, we won't let funds stay in the fund for, more than 5 years, I think we had said. And, more appropriately, like we think that if we're not getting applications, then really what needs to be done is doing outreach and making sure people are aware of it, making sure that we are reaching people who may want to access that funding. So that is kind of the idea there. It's not to say that is the only engagement and outreach we will do on the fund. Certainly when we have our first funding round open, the Environment Department will do a lot of outreach to BERDO building owners, and specifically those who we've heard from that are experiencing challenges, making them aware of the fund. So there will be a lot more engagement and outreach. That's kind of like backstop.
Thank you. And then my third question, will building owners or project submissions be able to apply for matching funds from other grants or funding opportunities? obviously not two city funds, but if they were to seek a private fund or another type of funding.
Yes, as far as I know, there are no requirements on our end, and as long as there are no requirements on, the other side of things for funding, that this is definitely, we'd love to see applications where they're kind of piecing things together, and we really expect that when folks are coming to the fund that they will have done some, we hope that they've done some due diligence too, that will make their application stronger if they're saying, I'm using these mass save incentives, these IRA incentives. I might have this outside funding if you can help fill this gap with the Equitable Missions Investment Fund. I think those kinds of projects would be, well, you all will get to decide on how favorable they are, but I think those are strong projects.
Great, thank you. Awesome. Now we will open to the meeting to public comments. As a reminder, members of the public, to provide public comment, please raise your hand or type in the chat in the application via the Zoom meeting platform. If you are calling in and cannot use the platform, you can raise your hand by pressing *9 and send your questions to staff via email at BERDO@boston.gov. Again, as a reminder, we are limiting questions to 3 minutes to ensure that everybody has a chance to speak. We also ask members of the public to introduce themselves and their neighborhood. And now we will wait for members of the public to provide comment. Great. Hearing no questions. Again, feel free to type your questions in the chat or send them to BERDO reviewboard@boston.gov if you think of any questions. Any final questions from the board before we move on?
No.
Great, thank you. All right, moving on to our third agenda item.
Oh, sorry, Chair. There's actually a couple more, the fines and enforcement and clarifying
sorry about that.
topics.
All right, I'm moving on to fines and enforcement.
Hi, I will jump in for fines and enforcement as well. Next slide, please. So in this case, we had an informal public comment period on preliminary proposals, and here we mainly heard requests to clarify how fines would apply to building portfolios due to failure to comply with the emission standard. Requests for the Environment Department to issue multiple notices before initiating the enforcement process, and as well other general clarifying questions regarding enforcement and appeal processes. So in this case, we presented the draft language to the APCC for the first time. So all the sections that you see there in blue are new sections. There was already a section devoted to appeals, enforcement, and penalties in the regulations, and there was very brief language there regarding penalties, which you can see in section C, but all the rest is new language that comes from the preliminary proposals and the feedback that we received during the public comment period. Next slide. So in the past hearings, when we talk about fines and enforcement, we presented all the language in detail. So today we're presenting more like diagrams that represent all of these complex processes, hopefully in a more clear way and with all the timelines that pertain to the review board and the APCC. So first, we have the section related to appeals for review board decisions and flexibility mechanisms. These are decisions that the review board would make to approve, modify, terminate building portfolios, individual compliance schedules, and hardship compliance plans. So here, the appeals process starts when the review board issues a written decision, and then the applicant may file a written appeal with the Air Pollution Control Commission according to the time frame that is set in the regulations. You may remember that according to the type of building portfolio that you have, or depending if you're applying for if you're appealing an ICS or hardship decision, this timeline can vary between 21 days and 45 days of the review board's written decision. Once the applicant has filed a written appeal, the APCC would hold a hearing within 90 days of that written request. And there's two possible outcomes of this hearing. One of the possible outcomes is that the APCC upholds the review board's decision, meaning that the APCC agrees with the review board, and so the appeals process with the APCC would end there. The other option is that the APCC finds in favor of the appellant and returns the decision to the review board for reconsideration. Then the review board would issue a new decision based on the APCC's findings and determinations. And if the applicant agrees with the new decision by the review board, then the appeals process would end there. On the other hand, if the applicant still disagrees with this new decision by the review board, they could file a second appeal to the APCC, and then the APCC would hold a hearing on that second appeal within 90 days of the new written request and issue a direct ruling on the appeal, and the appeals process would end in that instance as well. Next slide, please. So the appeals process that I just presented is considering that the building owner or the applicant is appealing the decision of the review board. But you may remember that for building portfolios, there was a specific language in the regulations that were already passed, where a group of tenants of a building located or included in a building portfolio can request the reviewer to initiate the termination of a building portfolio. The review board could decide to not terminate a building portfolio after that request, and the tenants could then appeal that decision to the APCC. And it is a very similar appeals process, but just wanted to present that different special case where the tenants are the appellants. So here, once the review board decides not to terminate a building portfolio, the group of tenants can file a written appeal to the APCC within 21 days of the review board's written decision. Then the appeals process that I just described would start, which is that the APCC would hold a hearing within 90 days of the request. It could be that the APCC upholds the review board decision and the appeals process ends there, or the APCC could find in favor of the appellant, in this case, the group of tenants, and return the decision to the review board. The review board can issue a new decision and the appeals process could end there, or the appellants can file a second appeal to the APCC. In that case, the APCC would hold a second hearing within 90 days and issue a direct ruling on the appeal and end the appeals process. Next slide, please. The other important process that is sort of embedded in all the sections B, D, and E of the regulations as well as the ordinance is the enforcement process. And here you can see the blue steps that are the formal enforcement process, but the first step is in gray, which is the informal reaching out that the Environment Department does before the enforcement process even begins. So in cases of non-compliance, the Environment Department would reach out to the owner. This can be done through emails that building owners provide during reporting, calls if they provided that information as well, mails in the case of building owners that have not reported, for example, and then the Environment Department also has the practice of issuing pass-through notices. And this process can repeat itself, but the Environment Department is in constant communication with the building owner that is in a state of non-compliance, and the owner has the opportunity to correct that non-compliance even before the enforcement process begins. If the non-compliance is not corrected during this informal reaching out that the Environment Department does, then the Environment Department would issue a notice of probable violation. Once this notice of probable violation is issued, the owner has once again the opportunity to correct the non-compliance. If the non-compliance is not corrected by the owner, then after at least 60 or 90 days, depending on the type of lack of compliance, then the review board can issue a notice of violation with the potential for penalties and fines. Once the review board issues this notice of violation, the owner once again has an opportunity to correct non-compliance. Or in this case, the owner also has the opportunity to appeal this notice of violation, and the review board would need to consider that appeal at a public hearing, and the owners had the responsibility of publishing a notice of said hearing. If the owner does not correct the non-compliance after at least 30 days from the issuance of the notice of violation, or if they requested a hearing and the hearing had an adverse decision, after at least 30 days of that hearing, then the Environment Department would be able to issue an assessment of penalties and fines. Once this assessment is issued by the Environment Department, the owner would be required to pay the fine, or they also have 21 days to request a penalty reduction or waiver to the review board. The review board would consider that request at a public hearing. Next slide, please. And finally, in response to public comments that were requesting clarity on how building portfolios would be issued fines or penalties, here we spelled out how the different fines would work for the different types of lack of compliance for building portfolios. So first, in the case of failure to comply with reporting and verification requirements, the fines would apply to each building for which the requirements were not met. You may remember that building portfolios would still need to report their annual energy and water use for all their buildings. So let's say that they only forgot to report one of the buildings of their building portfolio, the fine would only apply to that one building. The same would happen for failure to accurately report information. So if during the third-party verification process, they find that only the data of one building was incorrect and the owner does not correct that information, then the fine for that failure to comply would apply only to that one building and not, let's say, the 10 buildings that are in the building portfolio. The case is different for failure to comply with emission standards, because you may remember that building portfolios complied with a single portfolio level emission standard. So there's no way to determine if an individual building is in compliance or not with the emission standard, because there's just the portfolio emission standard. So in that case, if there's a failure to comply with the portfolio level emission standard, then the fines would apply to each building in the building portfolio, except for any building that is required to and thus meet a more stringent or net zero emission standard prior to 2050 that is set through zoning requirements. Next slide, please. And I'll pass it back to Hannah for some final clarifying regulations that we also added.
Okay, thanks, Claudia. So we did want to, we have over the last year and a half, we've identified a few other tweaks that we realized we need to make to regulations. So these are in a variety of different spots in the regulations of proposed updates we have. So next slide. The first thing we wanted to update is our regulations around vacant buildings. So in the regulations currently, vacant buildings do not need to get third-party data verified with their reporting when there's a third-party verification requirement. As we're now thinking about emissions compliance, we think that fully vacant buildings don't make sense to have them have to comply with the emissions standards either. We expect a fully vacant building won't be using energy, or if they are using some, it'll be for lighting or something very minor. So we're saying that a fully vacant building that is vacant for the entire compliance year, so again, like vacant or a under construction building, that they don't need to come into compliance with the emission standard. And so this will mostly mean that they don't need to go through all the reporting requirements, and they'll get flagged differently in our system as well for that compliance. They will still have to follow other reporting requirements and have to maintain the status of a vacant building with documentation submitted in writing to the Environment Department annually. And then finally, when a building no longer meets the definition of a vacant building, or when they receive a certificate of occupancy, then they'll have to be compliant again with the emissions standard. Under building portfolios, we also are adding some clarification around vacant buildings. We're saying that if a building portfolio includes a vacant building or an existing building in a building portfolio becomes vacant, then that vacant building shall not be included in determining the emission standard or used to achieve compliance with the building portfolio's emission standard. So basically, this is saying that, let's say you have a portfolio of 10 buildings. During that time period, you've gotten that portfolio already approved, but you are planning on demolishing one of your buildings, and building a new building in your portfolio, or then we're saying that while that building is fully vacant, so waiting to be demolished, nothing is turned on, that during that, if that's happened for the full year, you can include that in your portfolio, because that would be a lot of square footage with very little energy use. So trying to discourage warehousing of buildings in a portfolio. Again, and then included language similarly. When it's no longer vacant, then it goes back in the portfolio. So in those cases, an owner wouldn't have to reapply for a portfolio. Next slide. One very minor tweak in building portfolios that I believe a comment had alerted us to is that instead of just having the clause about non-renewable or CO2 emitting fuels apply to on-site campus district energy systems, we're having that apply to also on-site or combined heat and power plants. So just adding that clarification around that in both of those instances, we're talking about non-renewable fuels. Under building use classifications, we have added language that states if Energy Star portfolio manager updates the property types listed in Appendix A, the Environment Department may update Appendix A to reflect those changes. So this would give the Environment Department the ability to add in newly created categories that Energy Star portfolio manager might create. So the example that is very bad, but I keep thinking of it, and no one has given me a better example, is like if a portfolio manager decides to make like a virtual reality gaming center as a building use type, and then we would pick which one that most appropriately applies to. Something where it's like new, it's not already in there, or maybe they change the wording slightly of a category, then we can update that. So we don't have to necessarily do a full regulations update to make some of those tweaks. And then the last on this slide is adding under emission standards that when calculating the square footage to determine compliance, that third-party verified gross floor area is what shall be used for determining compliance with the emissions standard. So that will be what we use to, we'll take total emissions and then the third-party verified gross floor area as the gross floor area to determine the emissions intensity and compare that against emissions compliance. And then when that is not available, we'll use assessing if folks haven't reported and done their third-party verification. Next slide. Then in policies, a few very minor tweaks. Again, the same language was repeated here around non-renewable fuels. So we repeated that in the policies, carried that over. And then the other is a policy we are adding that is, apologies, adding another meeting or to the review board's docket. This can be an existing, one of your regular review board meetings, but saying that the review board shall hold one meeting per year dedicated to hear concerns raised by tenants of residential buildings covered by the ordinance and to provide information directed towards tenants of said buildings. So this again is one of the ways that we are proposing to respond to some of the community concerns we had about potential impacts to tenants in BERDO. There is a lot of that is unknown about how BERDO may impact tenants, housing. So we wanted to create the opportunity and for tenants to raise concerns, to kind of have a seat within the to be able to present to the review board concerns and kind of have that space available in order to both get specific information for tenants, but also raise any concerns that might come up, issues that will be relevant to the board and to staff as we consider and continue implementation and consider any future updates to regulations. And then finally moved the process. There were some policies on vacant buildings that's now in regulations, like I mentioned. So I believe those are all of the updates. Yes, we've made it to the end, so thank you for your patience with the many detailed updates.
Thank you. Great. Now we'll be moving on to next steps.
That is me also, sorry. So I just wanted to share a few supporting actions that our team is taking that kind of help with the implementation and building owners planning for emissions compliance. So first, we're finalizing a public emissions calculator that will help building owners understand their estimated emissions performance and comparing that against their future emissions limits. We're developing explanatory materials that will target towards tenants, condo owners, and other groups that interact with BERDO or are subject to BERDO. We are updating guidance documents to improve clarity and reflect regulations. So those will be updated how to report guides, but then also guidance documents explaining the flexibility measures and getting into compliance with the emission standard, which is complicated, as you all know. So trying to simplify that as much as possible. We'll be developing information on how the city of Boston is complying with BERDO. And we will be starting in a few weeks conducting outreach to building owners with a 2025 emissions deadline to provide them information about compliance strategies and incentive programs and offer them opportunities to meet with staff to talk through their emissions reduction strategies and compliance options within BERDO. So also just flagging that folks can already reach out to our team at retrofit@boston.gov to set up some of those consultations to start understanding where they're at with their emissions and how they might strategize for future emissions limits. And then finally, we're developing grant programs to support owners in making decarbonization plans. So we're planning on doing some of those at the city level. I know the state also just released a similar opportunity for building owners to get finance or getting free decarbonization planning support. So we're continuing to share opportunities that are outside the city as well as developing our own programs. Next slide. And so these are the next steps in terms of regulations. The Air Pollution Control Commission voted to open a public comment period on the draft language that we presented to the commission last week and to you all tonight. And that public comment period is open and opened on Thursday and will close on Wednesday, December 13th at 5 p.m. Based on the feedback we received from the public, we will revise the draft regulations and policies, respond to comments, and then present any revisions to the Air Pollution Control Commission at a special hearing that will be just about BERDO on December 20th at 2:30 p.m. And here's a little graphic of that, but yeah, we have a comment period until December 13th that will close and the hearing on the 20th. Next slide.
Great. Thank you, Hannah and Claudia and the rest of staff. Those are some really great updates and a lot to get through, but I'm glad we were able to get through all of it. It's a lot of great information shared. So going back to the board to see if we have any questions with those additional updates that were shared, starting out with Board Member Boyd.
No, I am glad to see a lot of the tenant stuff moving forward though, because I hear a lot of tenant issues being addressed. And I'm thankful for that. That's all, but I don't have any questions right now.
Thank you, Board Member Boyd. Board Member Ellis.
I'm going to ask that you come back to me. I need to organize my questions real quick.
No problem. Board Member Jacobs.
No questions at the moment.
Great. Board Member Lattimore.
Yes, thank you. I just wondered a couple of things. One is how and by what process will the city kind of evidence or know that tenants have been noticed? And and then related question is, there's a lot of tracking and monitoring and things like that for the city to do. So I just wondered about you know, how the city are there automated processes? Is the city developing more processes to kind of track all these things, knowing when a building's vacant, knowing that when tenants have been notified? There are a number of those type of things. And so that's one, but the key issue is, how do you know if tenants were actually noticed?
Yes, so I'm trying to pull up the language. Claudia might be a faster searcher than I am, but I will just go from memory. In their app, ahead of the hearing, they would have to, or at the hearing, they would have to provide evidence to the board that they've noticed their tenants. And so that could be, a photo that they've posted the hearing notice in their lobbies, in common spaces, or provided them on like folks' doors. We provided a few options, but we would have to see some evidence that they've done that. And so it would be like a physical thing that we would have to see. I think we would also encourage, if they have email contacts, that might be another way to reach tenants more easily, but also posting at least at a minimum in the like common spaces. And it looks like Claudia put it in the chat. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. I see
that language.
So how, and just wondering about other processes where the city has to kind of track, vacancies and that kind of thing, so I'm just curious about what automated, if any, processes are in place. And I know the city's hiring more staff, or has recently hired more staff, but just what the at full capacity, how many staff will be assigned to BERDO, and what, if any, automated processes does the city have for some of these requirements?
Yes, thank you for that question. It is a lot to track. We have a data management system, and that is a software platform that we started working with last year and are continuing to build out. So that is where we have all of our reporting flows into, and we're trying to build in as much as possible into that platform. All of the other elements that go along with this for emissions compliance, tracking vacancies, things like that. It is a process to get to that point and have it all in one place, but that is the goal that we have. And that calculator that I mentioned, so like emissions tracking, that's all happening through that platform. And we are hiring a few more staff, but yes, I mean, it is a lot of work and there is a lot to track, and we are trying to constantly improve our processes. So that's a big focus that we have over the next few months, as we have this lull right now. And I wouldn't say too much of a lull, but gearing up for the reporting season. In terms of reporting, folks aren't really reporting right now. So trying to really clean up our processes so that things are as smooth as possible for this next year of reporting and years going forward. So it'll be an iterative process.
And my last really comment, I guess, maybe question, I echo Review Board Member Boyd's comment about being pleased to see the tenant piece, in there, and I'm pleased to, spend time listening to tenants for sure. It requires another meeting of the Review Board. Just wondering if that's, if it's possible to, or can the board, kind of be flexible and have the ability to listen to tenants in other ways, meaning just entertain tenants coming into projects and listening to their comments in general. I mean, coming into meetings, review board meetings, and listening. So just want to clarify, it's not like one meeting where we hold for tenants to come in.
Absolutely. So board meetings are public. Any tenant can attend, provide comment in the same way as any member of the public. I think the intention with putting this into policies is that at least once a year, the board hold a meeting that is really saying, we want to hear from tenants in this space. We hope that our community advisory group and other community organizations that we work with can help get the notice out that this is an opportunity for folks to share feedback directly with the board, that the meeting will be geared towards them, and that information will be presented that is kind of intended for that audience as well. But certainly, I think, the board, if there's, you want to hold a hearing more frequently directed at tenants, that's certainly something that, Diana could work with you all on to add to agendas. And
or if we want to hear from tenants related to someone's hardship compliance plans, we could request that type of thing at a future hearing of that same building owner, correct? To have tenants present or hear from tenants. I'm sorry, I said final, but I do have one quick question. On the previous slide, you talked about a grant program to help put together decarbonization plans. I wonder how that differs from the equitable emissions fund, meaning could the equitable emissions fund be used also to create decarbonization plans, or were you thinking it has to stay, that's more implementation versus plan money?
The equitable emissions investment fund could be used for planning a project. This is just separate funding. So energy efficiency and conservation block grants, not community block grants. I always mess that one up. We got funding from the Department of Energy, and our proposal for how to use that funding is to create a grant program to be able to support BERDO building owners in making zero overtime plans and strategizing their compliance pathways. So that's forthcoming, but that's our proposal around that.
That's great. Good. That's great that there's more resources for that. Thank you. And then I would ask if possible, if you guys have that information about the state monies that are available right now. I don't think I've heard about that one. If someone could either put it in the chat or something, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I can pull that up. We sent that around to our BERDO newsletter, but I'll put that in the chat.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Board Member Lattimore. Board Member Nelson.
No questions. Thank you.
And I'll go last. Board Member Ellis, did you get your thoughts together?
I think so. And then I had a Zoom hiccup, so I may have missed a part of Board Member Lattimore's question. I think it's related to what I was going to ask about what Claudia has posted here in the chat regarding the proof that owners have to provide. I just want to clarify that applies to every single application process. So building portfolios, ICS, hardship compliance plan. What I mean by that is I'm just making sure, that opportunity is not just restricted to the hardship compliance plan. It may already be listed that way, but I just want a clarification on that.
So as written, it is just for the hardship compliance plan, not for every time an owner might be coming to the review board. And our thinking there was that though in the hardship compliance plan, they are, one, asking for the most relief potentially, and two, there are those potential conditions that may impact tenants. So we thought that was the, really the point where tenants should be involved and noticed of that. Again, trying to strike that balance of what is, overly burdensome for an owner to do versus, kind of the impact. The other piece that I'll add, and it's not a notice requirement, is that under the fund, if an owner is coming and applying for the funding, and I forget a specific language on this, but that it would be favorable for an application to have letters of support from tenants. So that's an area that we would expect tenants to come and say, hey, like this project's great that is being proposed in my building. I'd like to see that. I think that is kind of what we're thinking about for that, instead of having to notice the tenants of that the application is there, but certainly welcome feedback on those proposals as well.
So I have immediate feedback, maybe not for all applications, but for the building portfolio, having seen that you have an appeals process for tenants to appeal an existing building portfolio, I'm now seeing it as well, then tenants should have the opportunity to know about it before they even have to appeal for that process. So that's why, I love the way that it's written for the hardship compliance plan that owners should be telling them. But if we're setting up an instance where a tenant is now having to appeal a building portfolio that has already been approved by this board, you might want to give them the opportunity to know about it before we have to deal with an appeal process. So apologies. A few of my questions, I found some answers, but a few of my questions are actually about building portfolios right now, haven't seen all of these structures. So that's my first suggestion, that we might want to go back and adjust that language so that tenants have that opportunity. The next thing, I just wanted to get a point of clarification. So first off, thank you for clarifying the fines for the building portfolios. I know I had some rather strong comments last time regarding how the fine structure would look for the building portfolio. So that looked absolutely perfect for me personally, having seen the difference of the structures of reporting versus the entire requirements surrounding the portfolio itself. My question surrounding the fines, the comments relating to the fines and enforcement, did you receive feedback from the working groups on this as well? Because I thought it was interesting how short the lists were for people who were providing comments on this section. And I know that we're going through another public commenting period, but I'm wondering about the working groups, particularly like the corporate sector, whether or not you've seen some comments from them regarding the way that this has been laid out so far.
So on fines and enforcement, we have not had the same like a technical working group per se, but we've noticed, everyone who's attended those meetings shared the comment periods. We also had two sessions last week and the week before on these topics with the Greater Boston Real Estate Board and BOMA. So heard from folks who work in commercial real estate from that audience, and have brought these also to the community advisory group, but haven't had kind of that same. I know we've done it previously with some other topics, the like technical working groups, so we haven't had that per se, but have continued to reach and notice the same folks who have attended those in the past.
Okay, so just making sure that I'm clear, like I'm talking about like some of the working groups that have been formed outside of, to support the development and the work that we're reviewing. Are we discussing the same thing? I just want to make sure I'm not confusing anything here.
Do you mean the Green Ribbon Commission's working groups? Or
No.
Oh,
I
okay.
mean the ones that the city is working with. I know that we had discussed earlier on that there are other working groups that you are actively working with to get comments from. And I know like board member Lattimore and I had asked about being able to attend those meetings just to make sure we get a sense of what they're saying. But I just want to make sure that they've had a moment to review this, because I'm a little surprised at the lack of groups. Maybe we'll get more in this next commenting period, but I just want to make sure that they've had a moment to provide some feedback to you all.
Yeah, so I think or Claudia, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I think Stephen means the community advisory group.
There we go. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, so we have engaged the community advisory group on all of these topics, and we have office hours with them tomorrow and another meeting in a couple weeks. So we'll meet with them a couple more times before the next Air Pollution Control Commission hearing. So we've definitely continued to engage the community advisory group, and that is the one that has community organizations, affordable housing providers in it. I was thinking you were talking about the like commercial real estate groups and kind of the more technical working sessions that we've hosted, and that's what we haven't done another one of, but we've definitely been engaging the community advisory group as we go.
Thank you, and thank you, Claudia, for clearing up my language there. One more question and a comment. Let me actually start with the comment. So regarding the meetings for tenants, I'm going to ask the Environment Department for potential suggestions or to investigate whether or not there is a better time for us to be able to meet with those tenants, because, you know, we don't always have such a large number coming to these Monday evening groups. So if you have an idea of a better time for us to be meeting with them, I'm going to rely on you all to sort of suggest a different time so that we're able to meet with those folks. And my last question is regarding the building portfolio, coming back to that again. The documentation that you showed today discussed vacant buildings. And so I am wondering, is there language that a building owner should not include a vacant building in putting together their building portfolio? One, and if not, how is the Environment Department intending to screen for that when reviewing a building portfolio application?
I can start with that one. So for building portfolios, it is part of the eligibility criteria that there's no vacant buildings. However, owners could apply if they don't meet one or more of the eligibility criteria on their pathway 3, which was like the one that had like a required hearing and a more review process for the review board. This was for instances in which the reviewer approved a building portfolio that does have that vacant building, or if a building becomes vacant after the building portfolio was approved. And I forgot the second part of the question.
Well, it was just more so the screening process that you will have while looking at the building portfolio, but I think you kind of highlighted it there. So you may have answered both questions in one sentence. That's completely fine. I have no further questions at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Board Member Ellis. And I don't have any question, just a comment. I support the other board members in kind of sharing support around having a tenant meeting. I think that's a really great idea to kind of look at the potential unforeseen consequences or considerations around the implementation of this. And also I agree with Board Member Ellis and looking at like a flexible time to hold those meetings, hold that meeting or meetings to allow for more tenants to attend. And then also encourage the Environment Department to use the nominating CBOs and other organizations as resources with doing outreach to tenants. Yeah, but that's it for me. All right, moving on to the public. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand or type in the chat chat box, or if you're calling in to raise your hand, press *9, or to email your questions to BERDO@boston.gov. And again, please introduce yourself and your neighborhood as well. So now we'll give time to the public to answer any questions, ask any questions. Hearing no questions, again, feel free to type your questions into the chat or to email BERDO@boston.gov if any questions come up later. All right, shifting to back to the board. Any additional questions or last minute comments?
I'm all set.
Moving on to our third agenda item, administrative updates.
Hi, everyone. So I wanted to quickly show the proposed 2024 meeting schedule, proposing second and fourth Mondays for our meeting structure. The dates with an asterisk represent a date that either falls on a holiday or like a holiday observed Monday. So as a board, we can decide if we want to shift that day to Tuesday or decide how we want to proceed. As you can see, the first one's not until May, so we don't have to make a decision today, but I wanted to put it on people's radars because 2024 is around the corner. Happens so quickly. And other than that, I just want to remind folks that our next meeting is scheduled for December 4th. So board members, please let me know if you can't make it. I know December starts getting trickier for folks with holidays, but just want to make sure we still have quorum. I also wanted to flag I will be out of the office, but someone else from the BERDO team will be stepping in. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Diana. And on to our final agenda item, meeting adjourn. So now can I have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
So moved.
Second,
Second,
Second.
thank you. Now, can the motion, to all in favor, raise your hand, say aye.
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 Any abstentions? Any nays? Great, all of the ayes have it. Thank you for joining us today. The motion passes and we will be adjourning the meeting at 6:19. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Have a great Thanksgiving or holiday break, and we'll be back in December.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Be safe.